there wasn't anything that was ever designed by the town to entertain kids or to keep them from doing what they wanted to do. They left, except for me, who I couldn't leave the property too much. The rest of the kids could, they left in the day and they got back at supper time and they were going swimming and other things. But one thing we used to do was play baseball. But baseballs were with broken bats with screws and tape, balls that had many layers of friction tape on them. And one of the meeting places for playing baseball was near the Elm Street crossing, railroad crossing, in the field where Jay's garage was, or maybe still is.
We would, in the summertime, we'd go swimming in the brook. We had an old swimming hole there that they had dug out and made bigger. Mm-hmm. And we would play hide and go seek. And of course, when they brought the cows in at night after they got milked, they got set out in this little field, and it had an electric fence. We would hang on to that and get the one on the end really got it.
And we played dozens and dozens of games like Ring-a-Levo, hide and seek. Sometimes when it was getting a little bit dark, and I remember parents didn't really have to know where their kids were every minute of the day. We would go out in the morning, like in the summer vacation, we would leave the house and she'd say, be back for lunch. So we'd come home for lunch, we'd be playing with our friends. I'm sure they didn't know what we were up to. Sometimes it wasn't very good, but they didn't know, like kids today. But we played a lot in the barn. And we played a lot of, the girls played a lot of, the boys played the jacks too, jacks and jump rope and so much hopscotch. And we would have a stone to throw for hopscotch. I remember doing that.
Oh, we played kickball in the backyard. I wasn't very athletic, but that I could do. And tag. I went up to my sister's, Lois, who moved up on 152. She had 7 kids, so her daughter and I were a year or two apart. And we always played together, and we did pretty much everything with each other's families. And the Dawes that lived on Langs Lane, Courier, he lived up on Langs Lane, and he had 2 children. So we played with them.
In 5th grade, we went to the Historical Museum, and I have a good memory there. We used to bring toboggans in and sled down that hill in front of it in the winter. And people really took some chances, broke toboggans, but they let us do it.
I call it range roving. Because of where we lived, and because my grandparents lived next door on the farm and had that farm, and it was before the area was built up, on weekends and stuff, we would get out of school and we would just run the woods and follow the high tension line, end up out on the bay. My mother would pack us a lunch and off we'd go, and we just knew we had to be home around 5 o'clock. It was a little bit different for us because we didn't live in town, so we didn't have like a close neighborhood, but we always had cousins next door.
Because of the baby boom, there was plenty of kids. The neighborhood, I think we counted once in our neighborhood of Nichols Ave and Lincoln in Washington Street, 50 to 60 kids. The largest family being the Arsenaults, who had 8 children. And unlike the technology today, not knocking anything today, it's all different, but we didn't have the phones or the electronics. Our TV in the 50s was black and white. And so we were actually made to go outside and play every day. And we did. Have memories of us in the neighborhood building a lot of forts and cabins. We would go around, scrounge up nails, scrounge up boards, and just never realizing that we may be infringing on other people's property, but people were very gracious and they allowed us kids to be kids.
As growing up at that time, that was when the entire town would close down for the first 2 weeks in July. And a lot of families didn't even have cars. They would work, mother and father would work in the shoe shop, so they were walking, back and forth to work. And the first 2 weeks of July was vacation time. Stores would close, and people would either go away or they would be around town looking for things to do. And there were 4 or 5 families that every year we would get together and we would go camping at the old scout camp up on the river where the spring is and stuff. And actually what's really neat is when the mills were in operation up through the 30s, that was known as Crystal Springs Park. And they used to have a boathouse on the river, and they had a pavilion up there, and they'd go roller skating and all that stuff. So there was a history of that being a gathering spot. But we would be up there with the Lemures and the McDougals and the Pomeroys and the Provosts and the Reardons, and we'd camp for 2 weeks and campfires and all that. And people from town would come up by boat. And Bijou Chantry would come up with his guitar and Leanna, and we'd sit around the campfire and sing songs. So I think that's why I always felt a closer connection to Newmarket.
In New Village, we were always outside. I mean, there was the Russells and the Cardins and the Grouchmills and the Nesbitts and the Carmichaels around the corner. We were outside all the time. We were either riding our bikes or playing dodgeball or kick the can, stuff like that. It was no end of kids to play with. That's where I got my first two-wheeler bike. I was so excited for that. And we'd put our baseball cards in the spokes with a clothespin and make it a lot of noise. It was just fun. You could go in different streets, and find so many friends to play with. And those are my lifelong friends, those kids. 60 years later, 70 years maybe.
Living in Newmarket, you're close to everything. We could walk everywhere, we could bicycle everywhere, and there was no fear of getting into trouble. There was very little crime, and so kids just went where they wanted, when they wanted. It's funny, people talk about what you do in Newmarket. In our time, there were like 4 or 5 areas where kids got together, and you could say New Road, Maple Crest, New Village, and Durham Side. And Durham Side included Bay Road and Lamprey Street and on down to Dame Road and so forth. But it didn't matter where you came from. Everybody got together at Nichols Avenue and we played baseball, soccer, football, pickup football. You could do just about anything.
Wow. Well, when I look back on it now, it seemed like the summer was years long, and we did just so much in the village, playing baseball and wiffle ball and things like that during the summer. And I can remember riding my bike around there, and we'd walk out to what we call Sliding Rock, where there's now condos and everything, and you had to walk through bushes and trees and everything. But we played a lot of baseball and cars and trucks and stuff like that when we were, that age, younger, junior high.
So we all tended to do more outdoor activities, and again, at that point in Newmarket, I mean, you could just walk out the door and your friends would be there, or you could go downtown and meet people. And what was nice is that everybody got along. There weren't cliques, or there weren't people that you weren't supposed to associate with. Everybody associated with everybody else, and that's one of the things that I think has always made Newmarket wonderful.
Even though as much as a child I thought it was a pain to live in a town where everybody knew you and everybody was watching you, so you couldn't do anything wrong because it would get home before you got there. Mm-hmm. But it really was a great thing to grow up into a town that everybody knew you. You felt safe walking at night because you had to be in when the fire alarm rang. So you had to be home by 9. Mm-hmm. Didn't want to get caught with that. Mm-hmm. But, it was just it was a great place to grow up and live for me.
I started school where where the old fire station is?
Yeah.
The brick building next to it.
Yeah.
I was 4 years. I'm in first grade right there,
Okay.
and fourth grade.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there I went to the stone school, 5th and 6th grade, then up to the high school.
We went down where the old fire station was. And we had 2nd, 3rd, and 4th there. And then we went back up to the stone school for 5th and 6th.
One teacher that I gave you the photo of with the young man standing in the parking lot was Sister Charlotte, and she was probably one of my favorite teachers of all times, just very funny, very involved with the kids.
I remember elementary school. It's right where the old high school used to be, and the senior citizen live there now. But I remember walking to school from New Village. We walked the back way, came down Dump Road and that way to school. And I just remember it was fun. My Mrs. Witherell was my first grade teacher. And one day I think I had some gum in my mouth, and she asked me a question, and I had the gum up here by the side of my teeth. She says, "You have gum in your mouth?" And I said, "No." I opened my mouth and it fell down. And she said, "You're staying after school today." Well, I didn't. I went home because my mother wouldn't know where I was if I didn't come home. Mm-hmm. So then I had to tell my mother that I had gotten in trouble with the teacher. So I had to stay up to the second day, but at least she knew I was going to be staying after school. But I liked the 2nd grade. Mrs. Nesbitt was really nice. We went on a train ride from Newmarket to Durham to see the cows and make butter. And Mrs. LeBranch was in the 3rd grade. She was pretty strict, but I think we made puppets that year, puppet heads, and did things like that. And then Mr. O'Connor was in the 4th grade. And actually, he wasn't married at that time, and he lived next door to us on South Main Street. He rented the little house in the corner. Mm-hmm. So he lived there, but he was also our 4th grade teacher.
Well, the elementary school was up on, not the Stone Church became 5th grade, but before that we were at the big brick building up on the hill.
Granite Street?
Granite Street, yeah. We were there grades 1 through 4, 5 at what became the historical museum is what I meant to say. And then at grade 6 we moved to the high school.
Do you have any?
To the high school, the principal then was Leo Landrock, for whom the field is named. I'd have to say we were all quite certain we did not want to have Mr. Landrock mad at us for any reason. On the very first day we were there, because kids coming from St. Mary's, unlike the kids who'd been in the public school system, who had been there for 2 years already, 7th and 8th grade were always part of the, we were kind of getting more of an introduction. So he's got us all in what was then the cafeteria. So you have to remember, when I first went there in 1967, the only parts of the building were the small front part and the gymnasium, which is now where that houses the cafeteria currently. So those were the only two parts, and there was no hot lunch in those days, but there was a cafeteria. We're in the cafeteria, and he selected me for a demonstration, and he made me go stand with my nose against the wall in the corner and stand on my tiptoes to inform us that that's what would happen to people if they disobeyed. And so after some time standing on my tiptoes with my nostrils rather firmly implanted against the wall, I was allowed to sit back down. He later told me he thought that he knew that I could handle that. And I thought, so I was glad to know that I looked formidable.
I went to school all my life in Newmarket.
Where were the schools located?
The first one was on the hill where the elderly apartments are.
At Grand Street?
Yes. And I went there till 4th grade. And then we went to the Stone School, who was, they had 2 years, two years, yeah, 2 years. And then we went up to the high school for junior high.
Grades here in the town hall. This was part of school, but I want to say, I don't know if it was, because I remember my brother coming here in junior high, but I never came here just for classes. He was just a year behind me, but all my classes were at the school.
One of the math teacher that I worked for, one of the teachers was a math teacher, and she was the wife of the principal at Newmarket High School. And she and I became good friends, and she was impressed with the work I did at Oyster River. So we had a teacher who was planning to retire in Newmarket, but they wanted to keep her, so they offered her a half-time position. So she would teach just 8th grade, not 7th and 8th grade. That's what middle school teachers did at that point. And she agreed, and so after some interview process for me, they offered me the 7th grade half-time job, with the stipulation that could I get my competency certification before I could be hired back for another year, which I did. And so I was certified both to teach social studies and physical education, and taught both for all the rest of that time. So.
And then you taught both 7th and 8th.
Right.
After that first year.
Yep. And then I think maybe about 13 years into it, I switched to the high school, and then did the rest of my time teaching high school. And then at the very end, I became half-time again, and taught for about another 10 years maybe as a half-time teacher at the high school level.
My grandparents ran Jordan's Restaurant downtown at 98 Main Street. So every day at noon, the folks from the mills would come over to my grandfather's restaurant. He did most of the cooking, and they lived upstairs from the building.
I remember the grocery store. I remember most of the businesses. I remember the 5 and 10 cent store. I remember Rexall's drugstore. I remember Bob Russo's shoe store, and Jake's and Bunham's barber shop, and the IGA and the First National grocery stores, Rockingham National Bank. Those are kind of memories on top, yeah.
Businesses. Our family didn't own a car until the mid-'60s, so our whole life was Newmarket. Just walking to all the different establishments, and there were many. Downtown there was a couple of grocery stores, the IGA run by Charlie LaBranch, and then the First National. There was the Star Theater. I remember the last movie I saw there, Robbie the Robot. And, you know, like the Star Theater, it didn't have a snack bar, so we would stop in at Blanchette's Bakery and buy our popcorn and then take it to the Star Theater.
My grandmother and grandfather came into town because they weren't making a living on the farm. So they came into town, and my grandmother worked in the mills.
My mother, probably in the late 50s, maybe mid to late 50s, she worked at McAllen's in the mica department. She worked second shift, because I remember we lived down Grape Street at that time. So Sophie Russell was a big help for us because my mother worked second shift and my dad worked days. So sometimes they'd all get together at Sophie and Wayne Russell's house, and they would watch us sometimes when my mom was working.
Yeah, so my gram, Ruth, and her sister Mildred, they worked in the mills. There's a quilt down at the Historical Society because they were smuggling pieces of scrap out so Great Grammy could make a quilt.
My father's brothers, they all went into the shoe shop. You know, by then the mills had left. So then it was a big shoe industry, and almost all of them worked into the shoe shops.
I worked all kinds of odd jobs. I worked in the shoe shop for a while. Funny story about the shoe shop, you know, when Sam Smith Shoe was in big operations shipping shoes all over the world, they was having trouble selling shoes to the southern states because inside the shoe there was a nomenclature that said Little Yankee. They were called Little Yankee shoes. So one of my jobs was to take from a big roll of stickers and sticker over the Little Yankee with Little Debbie. And that's how they stayed out of trouble with the Southerners.
I worked in McAllen for a while. I thought it was neat because I think I was getting $2 an hour. Man, I thought I was really knocking down the change, you know. Now, I worked at the McAllen for a while.
Was this during the summer?
Yeah. And I remember, because we would be encouraged to look for a job during the summer. And one of the things that we were told, don't ever tell them you're going back to school, okay? Because if they know that you're only working for the summer, they probably won't hire you, okay? Just tell them you're looking for a job. Okay, so I'm looking for a job. And like I say, I worked at McAllen. I thought that was okay, you know. I worked, I think, 2 days at Sam Smith Shoe, and it absolutely drove me insane. I had a machine where I would just all day long doing the same repetitive motion, you know. So after that, I decided to quit that, and I got a job working for the state road crew. We'd go around and replace guardrails. You remember the old wooden post guardrails with the wire cables and all that? Well, every once in a while, somebody would take and go through them or something. So they sent up a crew to go out and redig them and replant them. Now, it was hard work, but it was outside, okay? Better than the shoe shop, you know.
So at 16, said you gotta, I wasn't much of a student. I liked history, and I wasn't into sports. And so my mother said, the family needs help. So I said, okay, 16, you go down and you're going to go to work. So I go to the shoe shop, Royce's. And I had all these allergies and things, and I was on working in an area where you had cement on these shoes, and I said to my father, I said, you got to get me out of here. And so he was doing very well at McAllen's. Now they really were into manufacturing, and so he did well with the ones who were owning it at the time. And I had an interview, and although you're supposed to be 18 years old to work on a machine, So I probably was the youngest one that ever worked in McAllen's.
Sam Smith's shoes shop was in the Stone Mills, and their claim to fame is that they were a union shoe mill, so all the workers there belonged to a union, which was very good. I don't know if there are any people that are left that worked in Sam Smith, but as an 18-year-old, I was hired that summer of '69 to clean out the Sam Smith shoe factory, and you could just see all the memories, a lot of pictures and stuff were left behind. The brand name for the shoes there was Little Yankee. And yeah, they were a first-class shoe factory.
The Glenn Miller did play there. The actual Glenn Miller actually played at the ballroom. This is just before he became really big, but we didn't own the ballroom back then. No, it was owned by the guy who built the places, Urban Fellows. He's the one that originally owned the golf course. Yeah, he turned that farmland into a golf course, and he was a young entrepreneur, and he built the ballroom on the number 2 green.
I learned to drive, I was about 14 years old, and we had a job at the Rockingham Ballroom on Sunday mornings. We would have to take all the garbage from the Saturday night parties, events, and put them in garbage cans and bring them to the dump, landfill, and we would empty the garbage there and come back with the empties.
Forgotten. I worked at the Rockingham Ballroom on weekends, my sister and I, and my mother. My father was a policeman, my mother was a hostess. Joyce and I worked there, and I would do the hat check, the coat check.
So how old were you then?
I think high school. It was high school. So we both worked there, and we had to clean up after the people, after they left. We'd have to pick the bottles up, and the alcohol, and any food and stuff. And then working there, we got to hang out after we cleaned the tables and put the chairs up with George and Jeanette Bergeron and David and Glenn Bergeron. And we just have, I couldn't drink, but we just kind of have a little reprieve and sit and see how that night went.
My grandfather used to be the head machinist at McAllen's down over here, and he was, at an early age, like 21, he was the head of the machine shop. And he also, on that large one-floor mill, he used to run that machine shop too. So he got my father into that program, being a machinist, trained and all that stuff. And he was really good at it, both my grandfather and my father. But my father wanted something more stable, for a car. So he decided to go to the shipyard, at the Naval Shipyard. He went there in 1939, stayed there through the war after they got married. And so he had a chance to go in the Navy. They were going to make him a chief petty officer during the war. He was all set to go, and he got permission from my mother, who they were married at the time. My brother was just a young guy. And but the Navy turned him down, said that his skill set was too critical at the shipyard, so they kept him. They denied it. So he stayed there, and that turned out to be something that worked against him, because after the war, the economy went right down, jobs became scarce, and they didn't need anybody there at the shipyard, not as many. So they laid him off because he was a non-vet now. So my father said, duh, so he had a young family, because I was born then, and then he said, how am I going to keep my family going? So he decided to start his own business. He get into propane. Propane was a big thing back then, liquid propane, Rockingham gas. So he did some installations for Edgar Moisen, not the young Edgar Moisen, the father. And he hired my father, And he became adept at it so well that my father decided to branch off on his own with this other guy. His name was Fillion, Bobby Fillion. They worked together for a couple of years, and then they had a falling out. And my father hired Mr. Bob Shaw from Exeter as his lawyer. But as it, make a long story short, so now he was out of a job, didn't have the shipyard behind him, and now he had a young family to feed. So he told his lawyer, he says, what the heck am I going to do now, And so Bob Shaw at the time owned the Rockingham Ballroom, and he wanted to get out from under it, okay? So he said to George and my father, and he says, why don't you buy the ballroom from me? My father said, I don't know nothing about ballrooms. And he said, I'll teach you. And he said, so he says, I'll give you a good deal. He said, I'll hold the mortgage for you, and you can run it. And my father says, well, okay, I'll give it a shot. So he did.
Now, how did he have money to pay?
Well, like I said, Bob Shaw decided to help him out quite a bit on it, gave him like a personal, And, of course, he worked for Edgar Moisen, the Rockingham Gas, and Edgar really liked him, so he loaned him some money for it. My father borrowed from my uncles, borrowed a lot of money, as much as he could, and so he made a down payment, and Bob Shaw took the note, and my father started running it, and back then it was run as stags. It would come in on one side, like I said before, and the women on the other side. But there had to be a lot of fights, and my father said, maybe we should try to clean up this business a little bit, instead of getting the riffraff. And back then, cabaret-style ballroom was starting to come into effect around the country. So my father was reading about it. He says, this cabaret sounds like it's a pretty good deal. So he got in some card tables, and on the side of the ballroom, he had one section that he just had card tables with chairs. And the people used to come in, and if you had a date, they would put him in that section, and the single guys would be on another part of the ballroom. So my father, his business was so good that my father took out a 20-year mortgage. He paid the whole thing off in 9 years.
Wow.
9 years, paid the whole thing off. And then in the 60s, when they started going to like the rock bands, and Dion and Belmonts were going good and all that, and every group was sort of like that, 4 or 5 people, female singer and that. So my father switched to that, and it went even higher. More people were coming in. New Year's, we were selling out a month in advance, 2 months in advance sometimes. It was going great guns. So my mother says to my father, let's sell right now. She says, you've made it, you've paid off the building, you're making good, let's sell it right now, or we're going great guns. And my father said, we've worked so hard, let's ride it for a while. So they did. And they kept it through the 70s. And then towards the 80s, dance style started changing. People's entertainment things started changing. They started maybe going to the movies, doing this, and it wasn't a lot of groups going out. People going out, a couple of people at a time, and they would go out to eat, maybe a little dancing, but they wouldn't come to the ballroom and have big dance parties like they did in the past. So around, it was in 1982, my father says, I said, I think this is a good time to get out of the business, but he passed. He died suddenly. So my mother and I ran it for another additional 5 years, so in 1987. So then we ran it and we sold it to Mike Provo at the time. So in 1987, we had it in the family for 37 years.
Charlie came over with his glasses on the end of his nose. What are you doing here? What are you asking people to sign? And I jokingly said, it's a petition for your retirement. Well, the next thing I know, I own Charlie's store. So we changed the name to Mike's Place, and I spent 8 years there. It was interesting. Along the way, I met my wife, Shirley Malik, and once our son Christopher was born, I was really looking for something else. I didn't want to stand there and flip hamburgers and crack eggs on the grill for the rest of my life. So we sold it, and I banged around a little bit, worked for Diffie Hotels for a while, sold real estate. That was when we lived on Exeter Street. We had bought a 17-room Victorian that was derelict and fixed it up. And lo and behold, we ended up owning Rockingham Ballroom. And that was after we had started the catering service, which was named for my grandmother, Victoria. And it was a wonderful experience, but we paid too much money for it. And we bought it at the height of the real estate market. And then we hit the big recession of '87 right after we bought it. And that's when Pease Air Force Base shut down, Navy Yard laid off, all kinds of properties got dropped on the market, both residential and commercial. We got caught in debt to equity ratios. And we ended up, it just wasn't meant to be, because basically the ballroom was a weekend operation and it had a full-time mortgage. And people in New Hampshire didn't go out dancing in the middle of the week. So we had to make that decision. And I went back to school. We moved on to Beach Street and worked in tourism, planning and development field for the National Main Street program.
So I probably should have shut up, but once again, I started talking, and next thing you know, I'm heading this Friends of the Rockingham Ballroom to challenge the state, but also to try to figure out how to keep the ballroom open. And, you know, people complain about town officials. If it wasn't for the town officials in Newmarket and the fire chief, Rick Mulaski, helping us to take on the state of New Hampshire, the Rockingham Ballroom would not be open today. But it is open today. And so we ended up going to the local folks, and basically our fire chief stood up and said to the state, if you can shut those people down if you want to, but I'm not going to do it. And I'm going to support them finding a way to raise the money. And so it took us several years to do it, but we raised $150,000 to put in the fire sprinkler, and the ballroom is still open today. And again, Newmarket people got to do that. Bruce Hawkins and the Spectres played one of the first concerts there for free to raise money. Jeff Landrock and Ace Bailey and All Together Now, they played for free. We actually talked the Glenn Miller Orchestra into coming to New Hampshire to play at a fundraiser for the sprinkler, because Glenn Miller himself played there many, many years ago. And so, of course, he would want his namesake band to be supporting the town of Newmarket and the Rockingham Ballroom, right? And so they played at one of our first concerts, and they also played at the last concert when we went over the top. And we had to report to the town.
One of the things, because when I lived in Lee, one of the selectmen asked me if I would like to be on a senior advisory committee. So I did that for a few years until we moved here. I think it was only like 3 years. And one of the things that we found that we needed was some senior housing. And when we moved to Newmarket, we found out how much Newmarket does for seniors, the programs that they have, Senior Citizen Center, Sunrise, Sunset, and all the programs. So I think that's, to me, that's very unique that the town really looks after. And of course now they have so many programs for children in the rec department too. in that beautiful playground that they have over there off the ball field now with the water feature. And yeah, I think for a small town, I think they've done an excellent job looking after all the citizens of every age.
I wish they could do a follow-up article from the 1949 and 51 articles about what's happening in Newmarket.
As a community, the people, and the size of it, and I think just thankful that we survived through some rough times. The growth is just wonderful, and you know, the vision of the developers that have come here, and it continues to grow. Sometimes we think, well, it's getting a little maybe too big, but we're happy, and we're happy to meet new people too, and always ask, what brought you to Newmarket? And so I hope that everybody really, you know, it doesn't just come and go, that they go ahead and make a life. And of course, we set roots. I believe in setting roots. Yeah. So we've had our home for almost 70 years, and I've just had my 90th birthday. And so, yeah.
Well, I think it's a great town because I've lived here most of my life, and I've been very, very happy, and the school has gotten better, and you know, the police department has gotten bigger and better, and everything has increased and is very, very nice.
Well, you know, growing up, we had a town with under 3,000 people, I guess, and it expanded, and at the time we knew everybody in town. Now we don't know a lot of people, but the ones we have met have been real gracious and friendly. We've met a lot of people over the years. I met a lot when I was on committees and everything, and but in the last few years it's really grown, and we've met some wonderful people. As a matter of fact, we've met a couple of beautiful couples at the Thanksgiving dinner just this last Thursday, and I would imagine that they will remain friends, you know.
Well, when I was little, I knew everybody that lived in every house on every street. Now, I don't know anyone, hardly anyone.
I think it's the people in Newmarket. Plus, the people is important. That's the main thing.
People, knowing people will say, I knew your father, or I knew your brother, or we'll just start talking, you know. We knew so many people, and they all knew us. By looking at me, they'd say, oh, you're a Lang. I know who you are. And it just has continued. It's almost like a continuing story from younger days all the way up till we get to be this age.
It's been my home. I've watched it grow from the early beginnings. Like you said, having the stores that were all close by. Now I think the tendency is to probably do your bigger shopping out of town. Knowing it seemed like a lot of people when we were first growing up, it seemed like we knew most of the town. I don't know why. Maybe because we were younger and our parents knew a lot of people and they got together. Now I can probably walk downtown and probably not see anyone that I know anymore. That's probably not a bad thing because it's welcoming a lot of younger people into Newmarket.
We're a small community, but not, you know, I mean, there's other towns that are probably smaller than us, but when we need to pull together for something, whether it's good or bad, they do. You know, when somebody sees somebody in need or something, tragic happens, everybody pulls together. We become one, you know, which is a good feeling to be part.
It was a great town to live in. I'm glad I explored it all over the place with my bike. I went from one end of town to the other, and I knew people from every neighborhood. It was a good time.
I think that it's really a great place to live. I really am glad that I had a chance to grow up here, and I really love the town, and I think we've got a lot of great people here, from our schools and our police departments and our library and all of the different people that work for the town and the residents themselves. Just a great place to grow up. Still is.
Because it was such a small town at the time, and it still hasn't lost all of its small townness, even though I think it may be 3 or 4 times larger than it was when I was a kid. But everybody was pretty friendly, and it was very close-knit, and it felt protective, it felt safe. And even though it's bigger, I still feel safe here. I always felt like if I can get home, I'll feel good. You know, it's a good place to come home to. And
the good thing about Newmarket is we're running out of places to build houses and add people and cars. So that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. Looking back at my childhood, I was able to go places and do things at any part of town that I wanted to, because there was limited traffic, there were limited places, it was limited distance, so you could get almost anywhere, anytime by walking or bicycling or whatever. You didn't really need a car. And so I think that's what makes Newmarket unique, in that there's not, you got the bay on one side, the river on the other side, and not much real estate left to make a city out of this. So it's going to remain a small town, I hope.
The downtown itself is just a wonderful place to visit, a wonderful place to live down here. I live maybe a quarter of a mile out. I can walk downtown if I want, and it's nice. And just Newmarket has blossomed in the last few years with the businesses and the restaurants and the camaraderie of people. They help each other. I think that's the one that everybody needs to help each other to survive. And I love Newmarket.
There's so much to be done in Newmarket, and there's room for everybody to make a contribution. And you'll find that, you know, you come to a town council meeting, or you come to a budget committee meeting, or you get involved, and there will be room for you, and you'll be able to make a real difference in your town. And I think it's been that way as long as I remember, and I hope it always stays that way.
I think it's variety of people that it attracts. Back in the 50s, and especially the 60s, the proximity to UNH, it was like we were the other side of the tracks from UNH. And we were a blue-collar town next to a white-collar professor town. We had a different attitude about life and about neighborhoods and such. And a lot of different students from UNH would come, instead of being in a dorm in Durham, they would come rent an apartment here. I think the Stone Church is a good example of the eclectic clientele of people that it draws here. I'm always coming across people who, oh yeah, I lived in Newmarket when I went to UNH, and did you go to the Stone Church? I said, yes. So it's the diversity that we have here in Newmarket.
And we've been very fortunate that Newmarket does have a lot of dedicated volunteers, but we can always use more. Because together we all accomplish more.
I think Newmarket is, for me, it's the perfect place. It has everything you could want.